Hello, and welcome to the long-awaited podcast with Hugh Dellar. This is Campcast, the official podcast of the Campfire Speaking Group. As always, if anyone is interested in finding out more, you can always visit the Campfire Speaking Club page. And of course, if you'd like to join the club, then you have only to use promo code Campcast21, that's Campcast21, and you will get a free lesson when you buy your first packet. So, as I say, without further ado, my guest today is Mr. Hugh Dellar, HD, no less. I had a really nice time with Hugh recording this podcast. We talked about some pretty deep stuff, not just the standard ESL, ELT kind of topics. We talked about life and careerism and how to find meaning in life and all that sort of stuff. We talked about accent prejudice. And Hugh and I had a back and forth about that. I had a couple of disagreements with him, which I pushed him on, which was a really interesting conversation. We discussed the lexical approach. Now, most teachers who are watching or listening to this podcast will know exactly what I mean when I say lexical approach. For people who are not teachers but who listen to the podcast anyway, which is about half of you, as far as I can tell from my data, the lexical approach. Now, I do ask Hugh to explain what this is, but as you can imagine, Hugh is a course book author and a methodologist, so his answer gets pretty technical pretty quickly. So what I'm going to do is try and explain it on a much simpler level, which is my level. So the lexical approach, traditionally, when we're teaching in the classroom, for example, if we're using the communicative approach, even if we're using a traditional traditional grammarian approach, then the approach is very much, you start with single words, you start with grammar rules, you learn hello, you learn my name is, you learn this, that, and the other. And from those little units of language and those general rules, the theory is that you then have the ability to formulate sentences. And then by practicing those sentences, that's how you start communicating. That's more or less how the traditional approach works. Not always, but that's a pretty good approximation. The lexical approach takes that whole idea and turns it on its head. The idea being that you learn what are called lexical chunks. So instead of learning single word vocabulary, a lexical approach enthusiast would encourage straight away teaching collocations, teaching common phrases. For example, there's no need to teach the word or there's no use maybe to teach the word accident if your student 2 seconds later is going to go and say make an accident. Why not simply teach the phrase have an accident straight away? And so the idea is that by starting with let's call them common chunks of language, commonly used collocations, you're teaching the idea that language works in chunks, which it kind of does. I mean, research shows that around 50 to 80% of people's speech, native speakers, this is made up of predictable, interchangeable chunks. So there's definitely something to this lexical business, and Hugh and I talk about it in great detail, as well as a bunch of other interesting stuff. So I'll stop talking nonsense now, and I'll let you guys enjoy the podcast. Thanks for watching. All right, 3, 2, 1, and I'm joined today by the great HD, in HD, no less, Hugh Dellar. Hello, very lovely to see you on the podcast. How's everything with you?
Good, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me along.
My pleasure, my pleasure. So, Hugh, it's nice to be able to actually sit down and talk with you. I know we had, I reached out to you because I think you added me on VK which is
Okay.
obviously very much a Russian social media thing. And then,
Yep.
as a result, I started reading a bit of your content, and then
Excuse me.
you're okay. No problem. I hope you haven't. Have you had your jab, by the way? Have you had your
I haven't
vaccine?
yet. I'm still waiting. I'm still waiting.
Okay.
But I have had COVID, so but that wasn't
Okay.
COVID there.
Does that put you lower on the list or higher on the list?
I actually don't know. I'm 52, so I'm kind of expecting to get the what do you call it, like the notification that I can go and get a jab any day now. Really, friends of mine the same age as me are getting through. So,
but if you've already had COVID, then I suppose you've got. Well, I guess that they don't really know how much immunity that really gives you.
They don't know. So
scary times. Well, hopefully, we'll get done by. I don't know when did Boris say?
End of July, I believe.
Well, let's see if that happens. Yeah, not wanting to get too political, but yes, follow the science. Indeed. So yeah, obviously, and then I reached out to you saying, do you want to come on the podcast? And I think that you quite logically thought, oh, must be a Russian chap with a name like Mike, M-A-Y-K, and then I had to explain.
Yeah. But what is your Russian connection, Mike?
So there is one, yes, yeah. So my I lived in and worked in Russia for 6.5 years.
Oh, okay.
Teaching English. I studied Russian at university. My wife is Russian, so yeah, I do have quite a connection with the motherland. As you can see from my
I've noticed,
I've got a little Russian corner in the back, and yeah, and obviously like my my campfire page and this podcast is obviously aimed at primarily folks in the Russian community, the Russian ESL community, let's call it. Both teachers and students. And I was going to ask you the same thing, actually. Do you have a particular connection with Russia, or is that just my...
I kind of do, I guess. I mean, nothing as concrete as you. I've never lived and worked for any extended period of time in Russia. I'm not married to a Russian. And I didn't study Russian at university or even really speak Russian with any degree of competence at all. It's just the country I've visited most for work, really. I first went there in late 1999, and we started selling books there in about 2002, 2003. And over the years, I've just been asked back again and again and again and again. And I've been all over the place, kind of flogging my wares and kind of raising awareness of what we do. And it's just seemed like over the last sort of 8-9 years, for a variety of reasons, I think, Russia's been the place that's most receptive to what we're talking about in terms of an approach to language and in terms of an approach to teaching. And so I still visit kind of 2-3 times a year whenever possible. Still travel a lot around different bits of Russia, and a lot of the students that we get with Lexical Lab, both in terms of the language development courses and the teacher training courses, are Russian. So, you know, it's sort of, it's found me as much as I've found it, really.
Well, yeah, a happy coincidence, let's call it, that our paths have crossed.
You know.
Yeah.
Thank God there was somewhere that liked what we were doing.
quite. Well, I mean, there may be concrete reasons for that it was so well picked up by the Russian market. So we can talk about that in a sec, because yeah, I think there definitely is a reason. And so what sort of places have you visited? I'm assuming the Moscow, Petersburg,
Moscow, St. Pete's many times, and then after that all over the place. So I've been to like Perm, Yekaterinburg, Irkutsk, Vladivostok, Nakotka, Omsk, Tomsk, Krasnodar, Krasnoyarsk.
Wow, you really have been. You've been everywhere. That's almost all 4 corners. Where?
Norilsk, right up in the north in the Arctic Circle, right up at the top of the Yenisei.
Yeah, that's Norilsk is one of the that's the place, if I'm not mistaken, they've got that big factory there that I think once every 3 years
Norilsk nickel.
Yeah, the nickel. That's the one. It's the
Yeah.
nickel factory, and they release that red stuff into the river, and
That's
it would
it.
get.
Yeah.
Yeah, they get fined a huge amount every time it happens, but it doesn't stop them.
Oh, that's not Ilsk.
That's the Ilsk way. Very good. Well done, Ilsk. Thank you for your efforts. Okay, then. So before we get on to exactly what it is that's involved in your approach and the wares that you've been flogging, as to use your phrase.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little bit of a like a bio? Tell us a bit about your background, just academically, professionally. What are you all about?
So I guess I grew up in a sort of weird mixture of London and the South Coast. I was first kid from my family to go to university. I did English literature at Goldsmiths and got myself a first-class degree, which then resulted in me being a very overeducated factory worker for about 6 months because I had no clue what I wanted to do, really. I kind of had some vague idea that I might want to write in some way, but I applied for like 200 journalism jobs, but found that none of those were even interested in responding to me at that point. I then I was playing in a band and I was living with this girl, and all that went kind of pear-shaped. And a friend of mine who had been an old friend from music had then ended up becoming a teacher and was back in London, having lived in Iran and Ethiopia and Indonesia. And this seemed impossibly exotic to me at this point in the early 90s. And he persuaded me to do a CELTA. So I spent 8 months working in a pub, saving up money, did a CELTA course, got a job in Indonesia, and off I went. And I've kind of never looked back from there, really. So in 1993, I went off to work in Indonesia. Spent a few years there, came back, did my Delta, did my MAT Sol, and literally the year I finished my MAT Sol, my first book came out, Innovations, in 2000. And I've kind of been writing and teaching and training ever since. I did almost 20 years at University of Westminster in London until they made all of us redundant apart from the 2 non-union members. Purely coincidental, I'm sure. And since 2014, I've basically been self-employed, and along with my co-author, Andrew Walkley, we've been kind of writing, running Lexical Lab, running a summer school, doing online teaching, online teacher training, teacher development, and training sessions abroad.
And here we are. So obviously Lexical Lab and teaching English is all well and good, but I think there's 2 questions that people are going to want to know the answer to here. What did you play in the band, and what kind of factory did you work in?
Yeah, the band, I mean, from when I was like 16 to like 21, I was kind of really serious about music, and we had a record deal and we toured all over the place, and I was the front man, the singer and the harmonica player. And we made an album in 1991, and then we split up and didn't really talk to each other for about 20 years. And in 2011, the album got a weird reissue by the German label that put it out, like a 20th anniversary kind of collection.
I've got Google on the go right now. What was the name of the album, or the band even?
The Beat Pack, BEATPACK, the Beat Pack. And then we started playing again and started recording again, and we've been doing that ever since. And I still just sing and play harmonica.
Wow, very nice.
So that's my
harmonica's a weird instrument. It's a weird, because don't they come in different keys?
They do.
Like you can get like a C major harmonica. And,
you can, and depending what key the song you're playing is in, you play in a different key.
So there's nothing that's different about the differences between the little holes. And sorry, I'm explaining this really badly. I don't know how a harmonica works.
They're just in a different key.
So it's rather like putting a capo on the neck of a guitar.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And the factories. Sorry, go on.
Factories. I've done all kinds. I've worked in a pickle factory. I've worked in car factories. I've made sandwiches in sort of weird chemical factories. I've worked in a charcoal factory. All the glamorous jobs before I was a teacher.
Well, there we go. There we go. A pickle factory.
Oh God,
I can't imagine like how complicated is the pickling process, but I guess it must be very if you need a whole factory.
Pretty simple.
Okay, so
fill bucket of onions, carry bucket of onions, put bucket of onions in your section of machine. Go back, repeat. Repeat.
You know those guys when they're repairing the road or putting down some tarmac or something, and there's the guy standing there with a stop go sign.
Yeah.
So like you know these
like
days,
that.
yeah, these days obviously there's temporary traffic lights, but there used to be the guy stand there with a big stop sign. He twists it 180 degrees and it says go. I remember that when we were driving past roadworks like that, my mum would point at that person and say, "Look, if you don't try hard in school, that's the job you're going to get." Which I loved. I said like that, Mum. You know, I'm 5. That's a great job. As far as I didn't phrase it quite as eloquently as that, but I said that sounds fine by me. I want to be the stop go man.
You learn something from all of these experiences, and I realised later, actually, I mean, all of that helped me massively when I started teaching. I think, and I think the fact that I kind of came at education from a kind of, I don't know, a slightly kind of outsider perspective was very useful for me. I now realise, you know, didn't necessarily know it at the time, but I think the fact that I'd already met and mingled with an incredibly sort of wide range of different people and learned how to be around different kinds of people was very, very useful. And I mean, I did other things, like I did door work on rough bars and clubs in South London, and that was all very useful as well. So when it kind of came to teaching, and you know, my nice, polite, upper middle class directors of studies were asking me if I thought I'd be able to kind of deal with crowd control, it was like, you know, how bad can it be? Does anyone ever come back and threaten to shoot you? No, I'll be fine. You know, so I think all of those things, that I always feel like this with friends of mine who've got teenage kids, where they're like, he doesn't know what to do with his life, and it's like, well, he's 19, let him do whatever shit comes his way, and you know, he'll soon realize that he doesn't want to be the stop go man or the pickle factory gopher for the rest of his life, and he'll do something else after that.
And if he does want to work in a pickle factory, then more power to him. You
know, and I was never that person who had a life plan or a career mapped out, or I just kind of stumbled from interesting thing to interesting thing, paying the rent as I went.
I think that's the right way. I've said this on the podcast before. Everything I try to do, I try to focus on what's in front of me, and I try and do that. Sorry, I hit my microphone stand. I try to do the best job that I can possibly do, right down to the minute details. You know, am I planning this lesson in the correct way? What color, what font should I make this so it's clearest on the screen? And just really focusing on the task in front of you. And then you tend to find that everything else is a second order effect, and it works itself out. Now, obviously that's a simplification, but that's generally true. If you correct the inputs, you will get desirable outputs.
And I think just also kind of following your nose, following your interests, and like you said, kind of putting some love into what it is you're working on and seeing where that leads you.
Yeah, and that results in happy teachers, happy students. You know, getting more specifically talking about English now. That results in happy teachers, happy students, and you know, someone who really shows love for the craft and is not just going through the motions, is not just box ticking. You tend to find that you know, those types of teachers, they need very little in the way of guidance. It just it works itself out.
No, I couldn't agree more.
And the dangerous thing as well with you know, with, like, as you say, like trying to, because there's nothing wrong with career planning, obviously, but you know, obsessing about it every minute of the day, and you know, fantasizing about the perfect life you're going to have 10 years down the line, and then when either that never happens or it does happen, and you know, this is how people have midlife crises, is that you know, suddenly you get to, you know, you open your pension pot, or you get to the big 50, when you've got the Mercedes, and you've got the house of your dreams, and you've got the kids and everything, and you're like, okay, is this it? Have I arrived? Am I on the golden shore? Is this the thing? And of course there is no thing. It's the journey, not the destination.
Absolutely.
All right. We got pretty deep there. Let's go back to let's go back to English.
This isn't your normal ELT podcast, I can see.
Oh no, there's nothing normal about this podcast. Yeah, we're pushing boundaries and redefining concepts, and that is a huge mug of tea you've got there, Hugh, if you don't mind me saying so. I thought mine was fairly sizable.
No,
Hang on, hold it up to the camera again. That is, how much tea does one man need? Wow, is that tea or coffee?
A cup as big as my head, tea.
Literally a cup as big as your head. For those listening, yeah, I can certainly verify that Hugh is not lying about that. Yeah. Okay. One thing that is obviously almost instantly associated with your name and your brand is the lexical approach.
Yeah.
Now, people listening to this podcast, I'm sure, have, if not know a lot about it, have definitely heard about it, but not everyone who listens is necessarily a teacher. There's some people who are just interested in English, some people who are members of my speaking club, and other people who are, CPD experts.
Yeah.
Could you fill us in and just give us, in a nutshell, what is the lexical approach and what distinguishes it from other approaches?
Okay. So I think the first thing to say is I've always seen the lexical approach as primarily being about an approach to language rather than an approach to teaching. It's a way of looking at and understanding how language works, essentially. And it's a way of looking at language that sees language as existing beyond the kind of grammar structures and meanings plus single words that I think still tend to dominate the vast majority of global best-selling course books. Not exclusively, and that's obviously a kind of oversimplified, I don't know, summary of what you often find in course books. But I think generally what you get is single word lexical sets and grammar structures, grammar meanings. For me, a lexical approach means thinking about the way in which things are interdependent and contextually determined. And it means constantly looking at language with an awareness of how language is used in mind, really. And that means thinking about collocations, thinking about the way in which vocabulary grammars. It means thinking about the way in which grammar vocabularies, at the risk of oververbing. Thinking about the way grammar interacts with other bits of grammar, thinking about patterns within the language, thinking about chunks, fixed little bits and pieces. And once you start thinking about language like that and understanding that that's essentially how a lot of language is, which isn't to say change and creativity within language aren't possible. I think there are obvious reasons why they are. It's just that those reasons aren't maybe necessarily just to do with grammar and vocabulary on their own. I think once you start looking at language like that, it then has a knock-on effect to the way you think about teaching and the things that you choose to prioritize within teaching. So I think with something like the communicative approach, say, it's very much an approach to methodology and task design rather than an approach to language. I mean, having read all the original CLT guys, they didn't have a huge amount to say about language per se, apart from, it'd be nice to teach a bit more structure, a bit more functional and notional language as chunks earlier on, which is why you got those kind of Leo Jones books in the 70s for Cambridge University Press, like Functions of English and Notions and those kind of things. When you look at things like, I don't know, Teaching Unplugged or Dogme or whatever, again, it has a lot to say about where the energy and motivation and creativity of the classroom should emerge from, and what kind of things you might want to talk about and all of that. But it doesn't really talk much about language. And so I guess for me, the way I now come to think about methodology is in terms of, well, it's informed by very strongly my feeling about language and how language works. And it's informed by thinking, obviously, about making language in the classroom meaningful and communicative and relevant. And, to some degree, not exclusively, but to some degree, kind of outcome oriented. But it also means thinking about other kinds of tasks, which I think maybe had been left out of the kind of hardcore communicative language approach end of teaching. But tasks which focus more on memory, on testing, on repetition, you know, varied repetition and kind of layering and building of memory. And I think in a way, this is where the whole Russian thing chimes with what we do, because I think a lot of that kind of pedagogy generally was much more common behind the Iron Curtain in the Soviet bloc countries than it was in Western Europe, where I think there was this kind of greater emphasis on individual creativity and expression and, you know, say it how you feel it, and a lot less to do with, yeah, when I first started teaching, things like memorizing or talking about repetition was sort of almost taboo. That these were almost kind of like, you know, like haram concepts, basically, where you just, it wasn't something that you were encouraged to think about or talk about or do. It was all about kind of, you know, communicativeness and getting your message across. And if you sort of suggested things like, well, that's fine, that's a really good thing to do, but you can get your message across much better if you're working from a broad palette and you have access to a far wider range of language than you can if you don't. And if you want to build up that repertoire, your palette, your lexicon, whatever you want to call it, your storeroom of phrases and words and chunks, that takes time, and you need to think about approaches both as an individual learner and as a teacher for facilitating and encouraging all of that. And so I guess what I've tried to do as a writer, as a methodologist, such as I am, is to think about both of those things, to think about how you can have meaningful communication-oriented classrooms, which also allow a kind of tighter, more honed focus on specific bits of language.
All right. So
yeah.
There's a lot here, and I want to okay, I want to slow the tempo a little bit, and I want to go back to what this, because as I say, a lot of people listening to the podcast are not necessarily
sure.
sort of methodologically you know, well versed, as I am not either. I'm just you know, I'm just along for the ride. So let's look at what this means in practical terms for a teacher, for a learner. If I'm in, let me know if this is a bad example for any reason, but let's say that I want to learn first conditional in a language class. What the typical approach, if you're using some, you know, English file or, you know, whichever communicative text that we're talking about, would be to say, here we have a preposition or whichever word to start the conditional, then we use present, then we use will, then we use verb. This is what it means. And then you sort of take a top down, or is it bottom up? I always get them mixed up. Top down approach, and you start from the structure, and then you build meaning, and then the communication comes naturally. What is distinct about how you learn, for example, first conditional or any grammar topic with the lexical approach?
So I would say it was interesting you said that the communication then comes naturally, because I would say actually it comes very unnaturally in that way of doing things, because what happens is when you're doing it that way is the grammar structure that you're focusing on in glorious isolation actually drives the communication. And so what you then have is a whole lesson where basically you have no other grammatical structures being seen or encountered. And the end goal of that lesson, once you've done your presentation, your concept checking, your drilling, your controlled practice activities, what you then do is a kind of, you know, 10-15 minute practice where basically all you're doing is producing first conditionals. And so you end up with these kind of things that I used to do when I was a younger teacher, where, you know, you'd go around the room in a little chain and saying, if I'm late home, I'll be in trouble. If I get in trouble, it will upset me. If I get upset, I'll have a drink. if I drink too much, I'll get drunk. If I get drunk, I'll have a hangover tomorrow. And you kind of go around the room making these sort of, cause and effect chains in order to kind of, it's a very behaviorist way of thinking. It's kind of, if you just drill the structure into people's minds enough, they'll be able to produce that at need in any given context. It's a lovely idea, but it doesn't work, as can be seen from any teacher who's taught for any extended period of time, because you see all the time students not being able to use grammar that they've taught, they've studied in these kind of one-off intensive closed kinds of lessons, because that's not how you generally use the grammar. We generally don't sit around in circles doing endless chains of cause and effect using one grammar structure. So I guess for me, the starting point would be, I wouldn't start by thinking about, today we're going to teach the first conditional. What I might think about, and as a coursebook writer, it's something I have to think about, is, okay, there's an expectation that at this level, pre-intermediate, say, students are going to meet and do some practice with the first conditional. Okay, what is a sensible context in which first conditionals are frequently used? What kind of first conditionals are frequently used? What might that conversation be? So that conversation might be, what are you doing this weekend? Okay. And the conversation might include things like, I'm not sure, if I have time at the weekend, I'll probably try and get down the gym. I'm not sure, it depends on the weather. If it's nice, we might go to the beach. Okay. Or it might be arranging to meet. It might be kind of, what are you doing tonight? Do you want to go out somewhere? Yeah, okay, that sounds great. What time do you want to meet? How about 8? Okay, if you're late, if I'm late, I'll call you. Okay, and then what you're doing is looking at a limited number of first conditionals that students might actually say in a context in which they're also embedding that with other bits of grammar and other bits of vocabulary they've already studied. And I think it's a different way of thinking about what you're doing when you're learning grammar. So what I would then be thinking about is, well, they need to have repeated, in order to really get how to use something, doing it in a 1 hour closed lesson where that's all you do and then not doing it again isn't enough. What you really need is to see the grammar that's commonly used in context over time in meaningful communicative environments or conversations, interacting with other bits of grammar and with vocabulary. And over time, you broaden what you can do with things. So I would see that, basically what I'd be teaching is, in this lesson, the goal of the lesson is to help you students at this level have a better conversation about what you're doing at the weekend. Within that, okay, the main grammar focus will be first conditionals, but you won't only be practicing first conditionals in glorious isolation, although there might be a little bit of that, okay, within the presentation. The ultimate goal is to integrate this new grammar into a conversation that you've already learned to have a more basic version of earlier on. And I think that that's also how people who learn first languages or people who learn a second language outside of a classroom generally learn to do things. So, when I was learning Indonesian, one of the first questions I ever got asked was, "Kamu sudah tinggal di sini berapa lama?" which means, how long have you been living here? Okay. And, in most course books, you don't see the present perfect continuous until, if you're lucky, pre-intermediate.
Sure.
But if you're meeting someone who's living somewhere, it's like, what's your name? Where are you from? What are you doing here? How long have you been here? How long have you been living here? It's almost like the fourth or fifth question you're going to get asked in a random bar somewhere. So I guess for me, my feeling would be you can learn that question and ways of using that question, and then later you learn to do more with it. In the same way, you can learn the present continuous. You can show a whole load of daft pictures like in English file. You can force students to say, they are eating their dinner, she is washing her hair. That's never going to help you say, they're denying him access to a lawyer, or you're not pulling your weight, or they're stepping up their campaign, or, you know, they're taking the mickey. It's not going to help you say any of those things.
They're prolonging lockdown.
Oh, let's not go there. They're lifting lockdown. They're lifting lockdown.
Thank God.
So all of those things, they go far beyond just understanding the basics of the structure and the meaning. And they have much more to do with knowing how the structure interacts with vocabulary across a wide range of topics. And that can't be learned in one lesson or at one level. That has to be learned over time, through experience, through exposure, I guess.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying about present perfect continuous. Yeah, I've always been slightly skeptical of the notion that, you know, that it's like forbidden knowledge, that you can't touch that structure until you've learned the requisite grammar.
I know.
Which is, you know, seems to me to be, you know, a cart before horse type of error. And, you know, obviously, you know, we are, you know, bashing English file here, you know, whether rightly or otherwise we'll let our listeners make up. But you do tend to find, in its defense, you do tend to find that there is somewhat of almost like a U-shape curve in the language learning journey. So for example, when the first you know, few lessons that you'll tend to learn, it'll be things like functional vocabulary for the classroom, saying, you know, we haven't even learned the verb be yet, but you know, or we haven't learned, for example, present perfect continuous, but you can still teach people the phrase, I have been learning English for 3 weeks, or you can, and as well, even with vocabulary, even though they are sort of single lexical items, which doesn't really, you know, doesn't really fly with what you're saying. Having said that, the fact that there's an article there, we don't just learn the word car, we learn a car, or we learn, you know, some tea, or you know, some coffee, or whatever it is. That, you know, you don't need to learn countable, uncountable. You don't need to learn articles before you learn those bits of vocabulary, but it's just, it goes, that's, I think, is probably in agreement with what you're saying, that you can learn these as lexical chunks of functional language before having learned the grammar. There's no need to do it in the traditional way.
In a way, if you think about the very first thing you usually learn in a foreign language, I mean, unless you're learning swear words or I love you, which is probably the first thing most people learn in most languages, probably what you learn is, what's your name? Okay. And, you know, then you just learn how to say Hugh, or, you know, I'm Hugh, or whatever. And you learn what's your name as a fixed expression, a fixed little block. You don't have that broken down and given to you as it's a WH question, followed by a form of the verb to be, followed by a possessive adjective, followed by a singular form of a countable noun, because already your brain would just explode. So what you learn is, what's your name? It's a question, and then you learn how to answer it. And I kind of think that, you know, if I've got an elementary student who's sort of going, you have podcast. How long you already do podcast? That student is quite capable of learning how long have you been doing that, so long as a teacher you realize that you're only teaching how long have you been doing that, and you're not teaching everything you ever need to know about the present perfect continuous. So it's just a different way of thinking. It's like, I don't think of that as teaching grammar. I think of that as teaching how long have you been doing that, and that's it.
Yeah.
You know, and that kind of comes from working from, what is it you want to say? What is it you're trying to say? Yes, I know what you mean. It's this in English.
So yeah, I suppose your argument is that initial part of when you learn English, when you learn phrases like what is your name, before you learn question words, before you learn present simple,
it's entirely formulaic.
So that should be the entire approach to learning, or at least part. Well,
there should definitely be a lot more of that. Yeah,
there should be.
And that goes on forever.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, in a way that goes on forever. So even when you get to a much higher level class, you get things like, you know, I don't really want to, but hey, needs must. Okay, they met the deadline with time to spare. You know, they don't even pay the minimum legal wage. We all got made redundant. I don't know why you put up with it. you know, all those kinds of things are basically advanced level language, not necessarily advanced level grammar, but they're advanced level utterances, and they're all quite fixed and quite formulaic. And I think a lot of the time, I mean, again, I notice it with Russian learners, that there's a tendency to kind of overlearn random single words, often from 19th century Victorian novels, and an insufficient kind of focus on just normal, natural, everyday ways of saying things, which are quite fixed and quite formulaic.
Yeah, I think this really goes to what you were saying earlier about the way that sort of behind the Iron Curtain, how the typical approach to language, and not only foreign languages but learning Russian language as well as a native language, has been, and to some degree still is, aggressively prescriptivist, centralized. And I've often said it's, you know, it is tricky. I'm sure you'll agree with me that prescriptivism is dead. It's an artifact of the 19th century. However,
I wish it was dead. I mean, it could be deader.
It could be. But here's the thing.
Nails in that coffin, and it keeps springing back up.
Here's the thing with prescriptivism. Would you agree that when we're in class, sometimes, depending on the level, we have to play the prescriptivist game? And what I mean by that is, it's all very well and good. So, for example, if I wanted to teach reported speech, I could go into a class and I could level with my students and say, hey, this is how reported speech works, but you don't need to worry about that, because you can go on BBC News right now and read hundreds of quote unquote mistakes, because it's a dying structure. It's leaving the language. You can try and make up all kinds of rules, like, if, Hugh told me that he, likes going to this pub. Well, I don't know if you do like going to that pub, but what,
I'm waiting for them to reopen.
Yeah, exactly. You can try and like make up some sort of rule that he still likes it, so that's why we're using a present tense. But you could just as well say he told me that he liked to go into that pub. It's a bullshit rule. Excuse my French.
Yeah, no.
So, but for the students, for me to go into a class and say all of that, to do that sort of information dump, is not helpful. So is it true to say that sometimes we need to kind of play the prescriptivist game and to say, here are the rules, this is how it works, and then allow them to go on their own journey of discovery to say, okay, we now understand that there's some leeway here?
So I think there's a definite argument to be made for releasing information to students on a need to know basis. Okay. And maybe let's look at it that way. Kind of, when you first introduce something, whether it's a grammar structure or a bit of vocab or whatever, you do so eventually in the knowledge that you can't tell them everything they need to know about that thing at once. Okay. And you basically give them what they need to get through whatever it is they have to get through at the present moment at the level that they're at, and you know that later they'll learn more about it. I think there's also a degree to which we need to be kind of norm driven, and we basically need to be, many things are possible, not many things are probable. And as teachers, we need to be focusing on the most probable things. Reported speech is a particularly kind of problematic area, I think. But just generally, like whatever it is you're teaching, in a way, there will be norms which aren't the whole truth, but which are norms, and which I think are useful for learners to be made aware of before they necessarily come to the exceptions. I think where that still differs from prescriptivism is, I wouldn't approach that saying this is the only way it is, or this is how it has to be, you won't see it used in any other ways, this is always the rule. I think what you can do is to say, okay, here's a way in which this thing works, which is useful for you at the moment. we'll build on this later. But for now, I mean, I have it all the time when I'm kind of learning Russian, where I'll say something to my Russian teacher and she'll sort of go, yeah, that'll do for now. And it's like, I know that there's obviously another way that she would say it or that's different, but I also know that as basically a beginner in the language, that'll do for now. And, you know, I'm happy that basically that'll do for now. So, you know, we had one this morning. She was asking me about pictures of friends of mine. And she said, what about this guy? What does he do? And I said, I have no idea how to say in Russian. He's an outreach worker for needy people who have come to the attention of social services. And Anita
I would translate for you, but I barely understand what that is in English.
Anita just sort of went, I have no idea what an outreach worker is. Let's just say he works in social stuff, okay? And that'll do you for now. And I think as teachers, you know, you're always making those kind of judgment calls. It's like, I understand what you're saying and I understand that that's what he does. But at this level, for you at the moment, you need a one-word answer to that question. So let's just say he works in social stuff, okay? Right. And so I don't see that as prescriptive. I just see that as kind of sensible, because you're you know, like you said, you're not doing that information dump on your students. You're limiting what they're exposed to, and you're giving them something that's good enough for now that you know that they can build on later. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also just recognizing that, you know, your class with your students is but a small part of their journey through the language. And I never used to think about this when I was a younger teacher. I used to think, what happens in my class is their English. And of course, you know, it's even if they do a 150-hour course with me, that's a tiny bit of their overall encounter with the language. And there's going to be all kinds of other input and information coming at them from the web, from other lessons, from what they read, from Facebook, from Instagram, from VK, from people they talk to. And my input is just a small, you know, drop in a much bigger ocean of encounters with the language. And the best you can do is to kind of, you know, provide maximum nutrients within that drop, and to maybe help them to frame their learning and think about their learning in particular kinds of ways, which won't hinder them as much as other ways that they could think about it. And I think where people get messed up is where they're obsessed with the idea that there must only be one correct way. And I mean, again, Russia's common like this. I'm sure you've had it yourself, where people will ask you, but did you say often or often? It's like, I have no idea. I might have said either. They're both fine. It doesn't matter. You know,
might have said either or either.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? And it's like those kind of people who really believe that there has to be one of those that's correct are going to struggle when they encounter the way in which language is actually used in all of its diverse glory out in the wider world.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. It's
you know, it's treading a line. It's you know, if you want to call what I've said prescriptivist, fine, it kind of is. I would prefer sort of norm-driven and utilitarian.
Yeah, that sort of incredulous question that you often get, that you describe, is that's something I wrote about recently. So I do like a weekly what would you call, like an article column kind of thing. It's called Technical Tuesday. Guess when it comes out. And so one of the ones I wrote about recently was called Why and Other Questions You Shouldn't Ask in the Classroom. And this question that comes up all the time, like so the classic one is countable, uncountable. Say, why is money uncountable in English? You know, you're saying you can't count money, and like that is if you think about what that question means, that is a question that does not have an answer. It by definition cannot. You'd
be amazed by how many teachers try to answer it.
Yeah, well, there's the thing. I mean, sometimes there is an answer. Like, if I ask the question about P's, why is P countable? That has an answer. If anyone's curious, it's because it used to be, as you know, of course, peas as in P-E-A-S-E, as in peas pudding, hot peas pudding, cold peas pudding in the pot 3 days old, or whatever the rhyme is. And by process of back formation, people thought, oh, peas, that must be plural of pea. And so this new word pea got coined as like a countable, a little green thing. But again, I could explain that to a student, but but what's the point? I mean, it's a curious little etymological fact, sure, but the fact that you're asking that question in the first place shows that you're asking the wrong questions. You're coming at it from the wrong angle.
Absolutely.
It's like asking, simply phrased, the question is, why is English not like English is? Yeah. It means nothing. It is a ridiculous question.
Or I guess the other question that's underlying all of that is, why does English do it differently to my language?
Precisely. And there's this
like, because it ain't your language. Is the answer to that question.
Exactly. If all languages were structurally identical with different sounding words, you could use Google Translate. Yeah, we'd all speak every language. You get that with people who haven't and obviously no disrespect to my sort of more scientific and mathematical brothers and sisters, but people who haven't spent really any time learning a foreign language before, which is most Brits, let's be honest. We're not really language learning people, generally speaking, with some exceptions. But like, for example, like I'll have like a colleague of mine who's, sort of quite sheltered Somerset kind of person who never paid attention to languages at school, asked me the question, Mike, how do you say will in Russian? Meaning as in future tense, will, won't. And, I'm sure already that, it's not really that simple. It's the same as like, Spanish. It's not a periphrastic future. And to even explain that question is meaningless to someone like that is really, really hard. So do people ask these questions because it's just this like innate bias that we have that, well, my language is obviously like the logical way of how.
I think there's a lot of that. I think there's a lot of kind of, we're all primed and conditioned to kind of expect things to work in the way in which we're used to them working. And when you're confronted with things that don't work in that way, it's disconcerting and annoying. Took me a long time with Indonesian to stop fighting it.
That's exactly the right phrase, to stop fighting it. I've always said the definition, in my opinion, of the infamous intermediate plateau is when you finally abandon that way of thinking, when you stop asking the question why, you just come to peace with it. And like and we've all had those types of students who their learning style is synonymous with resistance, picking holes in everything you say, always trying to find exceptions. I'm like, you need to come to peace with the fact that A, this is not working like your language is going to work, and B, that language is not, as you correctly have pointed out today, language does not fall into neat categories. There is no overarching.
Russian, it's like 20 and 30 is 2 10s and 3 10s, and then you've got 40, which is a completely random different word. It's like, why would you do that? Like,
have you studied how to use numbers in Russian yet? By which I mean how to say like 2 or 5 of something. Do you know how to say that?
I'm getting there. I'm getting there. Mad. It's completely mad. I mean, from an English point of view, you're just like, why do you do it like this?
You've just proved our point that the moment that you say from an English point of view, you can stop talking because this next part of your sentence is meaningless. From an English point of view, we're done. The English point of view doesn't matter. But having said that, it is mad. It's insane. I'm still in disbelief. The fact that
I guess, every language is mad in its own way. I remember very early on in my career being asked by a student saying, like when you have a football field, and I said pitch, and he went, no, field. And I said, no, pitch. And he said, well, why do you call it a midfield player then? It's like, because the midfield player plays in the middle of the pitch.
He's a good mid pitcher.
I see your problem here.
And having said that as well, a person who throws a ball on a baseball field is a pitcher, not a fielder.
So every language has its own insanity.
Well, again, that's another very good point, that people, and this is something I wrote about in the article as well, people very often ask the question, where's the logic? Where's the logic? it's like people who look at you get this in like quantum physics. Sorry, I know that's a really weird segue, but bear with me. So
No.
you look at a subatomic particle, yeah, something like an electron, and the electron disappears from its orbital field and instantly reappears in another orbital plane.
Mm-hmm.
And we look at that and we say, that's not logical. Yeah, it's still true, you know, as if the universe is obliged to be logical to us. Why would it be? It's the same thing is true about language. Who told you that English language, or indeed language in principle, should seem logical to you? Why do you think that?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. I wanted to another layer of complexity that's added to this is when we were talking about like reported speech and how that's a dynamic structure. So think about present continuous, for example.
Okay.
Just to pick one out of the air. We can go ahead and we could teach it in the traditional grammatical style, or we could use the lexical approach to, you know, try and, you know, get students using it. But then all of that doesn't change the fact that if you go ahead and listen to how English is spoken in India, then you'll hear the present continuous used in a complete, like, stative verbs. You know, I am understanding you. I'm liking it. So that you can hear Indian guys say that. And this is another topic I wanted to discuss with you, is the idea of you know, dare I use the P word, accent-based prejudice. So first of all, what are your thoughts on accent prejudice, so-called? Okay. And does it also extend to quote-unquote grammatical prejudice as well, such as in the example that I just described with
yes, absolutely, on both levels. So, I mean, accent prejudice is a very, very real thing. And I think what a lot of non-natives don't realise is how deep-rooted it is within native-speaking communities among ourselves, okay? And I've been watching this wonderful series recently by a guy called Darren McGarvey, who's he's a kind of Scottish rapper, social activist. He's off the estates out the back of Glasgow.
You posted that on your page.
I did. Yeah, I saw that. He wrote a wonderful book called Poverty Safari, which really kind of hit me when I read it, and I've been kind of following him since then. And he's got like a strong Glaswegian accent, and he talks a lot to people about accent and accent prejudice. And of course, what you notice is generally, but not always, the richer and more successful people are, the less likely they are to have accents which locate them in a geographically specific place. Okay, so, you know, part of what public school system does to people is it eradicates any sense of geographic locality, and it makes you into this so-called neutral speaker of the language, where you can originally be like Tony Blair claimed he was and come from the Northeast, but sound like you're just from the English upper middle classes. And that's a really common thing that happens, particularly within the UK. In the same way, you also get people who hold on to their accent very doggedly, even when they, you know, move up into more middle class kind of jobs or lifestyles or whatever, because it's part of who they feel they are and part of their roots and part of their history and all of that. And you will encounter prejudice as a result of doing that. I mean, I often tell this story about when I did one of my very first plenaries, someone wrote a snarky blog post saying, how can someone with Hugh Dellar's diction be given plenaries at international conferences? And there's a little bit of me thinking, Jesus, this is me trying hard. Like, you know, this is my posh voice. It's like, give me a break here. You know, but part of me sort of feels like, Jesus, this is never going to stop from these people. It's like, you're never going to be good enough for these people to accept you as one of them, because they know you're not one of them. And the other part of me just thinks, fuck you, I'll speak how I want. Thank you very much. Excuse my French. You know, if you're listening to someone's accent as opposed to the content of what they're saying, and you're judging them on those grounds, there's something deficient with you as a human being, I would suggest. And you're closing yourself off to the vast array of humanity around you who don't speak like you do. So I think both within native speaking communities, there's a lot of accent prejudice. I also think even among, you know, monolingual non-natives, there's a lot of accent prejudice. So I've met Russian teachers of English who believe that if someone has a stronger Russian accent than they do, whatever strong means in that term, they can't be a good teacher, and that somehow you can only be a good teacher if you have a kind of, you know, what they perceive to be a neutral British accent. And that somehow your accent is a marker of your quality as a teacher, which is, it's just bonkers. I mean, it's, you know, it's a quality of how many hours of your life you've tortured yourself and engaged in trying to sound like some sort of weird emulated version of received pronunciation. It's nothing to do with what you like as a teacher. You know, it's absolutely not. And so I think even among, you know, monolingual groups of non-natives, there's this accent prejudice. And of course, there are different people will have. So two other ways to frame this. I got an email recently from a teacher in Belarus who said, what's the hardest accent in the UK to understand? And my answer was, well, it depends what you're used to. You know, it's like if you live in Edinburgh, Aberdeen's pretty easy and broad Cockney is pretty difficult. If you're from Essex, Cockney's a piece of piss and Aberdeen's like a foreign language. So it all depends what your starting point is. And it depends what you're familiar with, which is to do with access to media and power and influence and exposure. You also do get, everyone has it, prejudicial or positive biases towards different accents based on your associations or affiliations. So, you know, French accents in English generally seen as a little bit sexy or a little bit naughty or just funny. German accents in English, all bad, Nazis because of World War II movies. You know, there are all these kind of deep-rooted historical prejudices that come into play that people have on an unconscious level that affect the way you perceive people's accents. As someone who's lived in London most of my life, I've almost got to the point now. I mean, I still notice accent and I'm still curious about people's accent.
Sure.
But I hear so many different accents all the time that you just stop, you know, I'm really listening to what's this person saying to me. Connected to that, I think there is also the grammar thing. And I think that's also to do with class and to do with power and to do with assuming that upper middle class norms are the only correct way of doing things. And so I have this Facebook group called English Questions Answered. And one of the things that often comes up on there is, you know, I was always told double negatives are wrong. However, what about the Rolling Stones song, I Can't Get No Satisfaction? You know, and so it's like, well, it depends what you mean by wrong. Do you mean it's not standard grammar as grammar is spoken by upper middle class people? Yes. Do you mean that there aren't large groups of native speakers who don't do that as an automatic way of expressing themselves? No. You know, so it depends on what your definition of wrong is. And I think this is the same with the Indian English thing, or a lot of Irish English, which is particularly idiosyncratic, or London English, which is idiosyncratic, is it's English that's used in specific kinds of contexts by specific groups of people as part of their identity. And to look at that as somehow being wrong is perverse. So I think for me, it's just about, again, the message we send to students when they come up against those kinds of things is really important. So it's like, it's not wrong, it's just a different way of doing it, and that way of doing it's quite common in Indian English. Doesn't mean every Indian does it like that. You'll meet some Indians who speak more RP than most RP speakers. You will also meet people who speak quite accented varieties of Indian English who will use the present continuous in ways that aren't generally used outside of the Indian subcontinent. It's a feature of the local usage.
Sure.
You know, and so I think once you understand language like that, and again, it's weird because with a language like Russian, it doesn't work in that same kind of way because of the standardization of the language and the way in which the language was disseminated through the USSR. It's much more standard than, say, a language like English, which is, you know, all over the shop when it comes to divergence and diversity.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm right behind you when you say that obviously making assumptions about someone's character on the basis of a regional accent is tantamount to making assumption about someone's character based on the color of their skin. It's you know.
And there are obviously ways in which those two biases overlap frequently.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. For
you
sure.
know.
But where it gets tricky is or confusing for students and teachers alike is how we, for example, I'm sure you've taught pronunciation before in your classes. I've taught pronunciation. So by dint of the fact that we've taught pronunciation, that we have to say, okay, there are some forms of pronunciation which are more desirable than others. But is there any daylight here between pronunciation and accent? And how do we recognize
I hear you. It's an interesting question. So I think the first thing to say is you don't need to teach long before you realize that your students are never going to sound like you. Okay. I don't think I've ever had a student who's left my class sounding anything like me, because they haven't lived in the places I've lived and had the experiences.
Worked in the pickle factory.
Yeah, exactly. They missed out on that crucial part of their pronunciation development. So it's firstly just recognizing that. Well, and also, I don't know how good your Russian is, but I mean, for me, trying to say things in Russian, getting anywhere near the way my teacher says it, I'm happy. It's like, if I say it and you can understand that's the word I'm trying to say, I feel a huge heave of relief. The idea that one day I will sound like a Russian is just, it's never going to happen. It's never, ever, ever going to happen. Even with my Indonesian, I mean, I like to imagine my Indonesian sounds sort of Indonesian-y. I've met lots of other Western people who I can hear have much stronger, say, American accents when they're speaking Indonesian, and mine sounds sort of like someone who lives in Jakarta. In my head, I imagine I sound like a Jakartan. If I say this to my Jakartan friends, they're just like, you're dreaming, mate. You sound English. So, does it bother me? No, not really, because I'm English. And so the fact I sound English, in my own head, I kind of feel happy because I imagine I sound a bit more like them than I probably do. And I can rattle out Indonesian quicker than other people that I've met who don't speak it as well as me or with the accent I speak. I also kind of stopped thinking that the point of pronunciation was really to make people sound like the model. A model is a kind of impossible dream, I think. And what you hope you do with the model is two things. You hope that people get close enough to it to be able to get by, okay? And you hope that it also helps them hear better when they hear English coming at them at speed. So for me, if I'm drilling, say, an elementary Spanish guy, and I'm teaching him how to say, how long have you been doing that? And what he's saying is, how long have you been doing that? How long have you been doing that? I'll try and remodel it. I'll try and go, yeah, look, and he go, buh, 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 buh. So, yeah. How long have you been doing that's fine, Miguel? Okay, for now, let's just leave it there. You can survive with that question. You'll get by. When you hear it, probably what you'll hear is, how long have you been doing that? Okay, how long you been doing that? You probably won't even hear the V. You probably just hear, how long you been doing that? Okay, anything between what you're saying and that is basically fine, and you'll get by with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly something I remember from learning French, when you can go ahead and learn the grammatical structure, je ne sais pas, but then don't be surprised when the French just says, je pas.
Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Even... You're like, oh, that's that. Oh, okay. Yeah. No one told me it was going to be like this.
Absolutely. So, I'm with you there. I'm with you there. Where
good enough is good enough.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Where it gets slightly more confusing, for me at least, is, so you were talking about like the teachers who have more or less of a Russian accent than other teachers see themselves as, superior or inferior accordingly.
Some of them.
Yeah, sure, some of them. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced that there's no truth in that, because so let me tell you about my experience like learning Russian, or indeed any experience learning a foreign language. To answer your question earlier, but I'm pretty happy with my Russian. I think it's in a good. I'm always looking to learn more, of course, as I'm sure you are as well with your Indonesian. For me, the way that native Russians speak is my model of pronunciation, and for me, saying something with correct pronunciation is synonymous with competency. When I'm mistaken for a Russian, which you know sometimes happens, I'm very happy to report. When people tell me that I sound like a native Russian speaker, I see that as the highest possible compliment. And there's no sort of analogous movement in the Russian-speaking world of native speakerism and of accent bias. It just doesn't exist, and that raises a little red flag for me. The fact that this really only seems to be a phenomenon in the ESL world, and so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. First of all, me saying that my ideal pronunciation, the highest compliment someone can give me is to say that I sound like a Russian. Am I being prejudiced there? Or
no, I understand that, and you know, not that it's ever going to happen with me in Indonesian for obvious reasons, but yeah, that would be a lovely thing for someone to think. I understand why people feel like that, and I understand that goal. I think that goal is quite specific to generally people who learn a language to a very, very, very high level. And I think that, you know, Russian teachers of English are often people who learn the language to an insanely high level.
No doubt.
And you're obviously someone who's learned Russian to a very, very good level yourself. Most students aren't those people and aren't going to need to speak the language to the level that either their teachers or you or I speak the language at, okay? Most students reach a point at which they basically are happy and they can do what they need to do, and then they'll pick up a few extra little bits and pieces related to whatever they're interested in or whatever their experiences bring them to. Mm-hmm. Most students also are generally learning English as a tool. One of my Chinese students once said, you know, like, I don't want to learn how to be like you. I just want to learn how to do what you can do with your language. And I think that's what a lot of students want, basically. It's like, you've got this useful tool, show me how it works up to the point where I need it, okay?
So we've come full circle. It's about functionality, and it's about, that makes sense.
With that, and you know, if you do have a student who really, really, really wants to learn to sound like a particular native speaker. I mean, I've had two Japanese students of mine. One guy I interviewed on the first day, and it was like, your accent is really weird, and I can see your Japanese from your name and your underlying accent, but there's something else going on with you, and I don't know what it is. Tell me your story, Yoshi. And he was like, yeah, me live at Jamaica for 3 years because I love reggae. And he'd lived in Jamaica for 3 years, working on a sound system because he was a huge reggae head. And it was like, wow, you've got like a Japanese Jamaican accent. That's quite unusual. And he said, like, there's other people who also sound like me who are Japanese reggae heads who picked up all their English from listening to Jamaicans. I had another Japanese girl who I was teaching who had this really weird accent. And I was like, have you lived in Liverpool at some point? And she was like, no, but I love Steven Gerrard. And she basically learned a lot of English from watching Steven Gerrard interviews and copying him. And so, you know, you get those people, right? You get people who, I want to speak English like Steven Gerrard. I want to speak English like Prince Farai, whatever it's going to be. And that's fine. That's their right. I mean, interestingly, often that will be aspirational accents that lie outside of the ESOL normal canon, which is kind of, you know, standard British English and standard American English. Often what you get is like, you know, Swiss German guys who want to sound like they're from East LA because they're into hip hop, or you know, Japanese girls who want to sound like they're from Liverpool because they love Steven Gerrard. And And that's often just to do with peculiar personal obsessions, rather than wanting to accommodate themselves to what they perceive as being the upper middle class standard. Because in a way, you know, if you're Japanese, the prejudices that the English upper middle classes have about accent generally doesn't affect you, because you're kind of outside of the loop in a way. It's like, I'm foreign, so, you know, it's like, it doesn't, you don't judge me. And people make allowances and don't judge you in that kind of way that they judge other British native speakers, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you do get people who want to pass themselves off as native speakers. But what that means when it comes to English is far more complicated and far more diverse than what it means, like you're saying, as being mistaken for a Russian, where it's a relatively standardized language with very minimal accent variation, even across thousands of miles of terrain. You know, you go from Liverpool to Manchester, it's a half-hour drive. They speak.
Not even that. You go from North Manchester to South Manchester.
Yeah, you know,
the difference.
And,
it's insane.
Yeah. And, you know, you go from Moscow to Vladivostok, not a huge amount of difference in the accents.
Yeah, I talked about this on, I don't know if you know Yulia Suroyegina, who's sort of, you know, fairly well known in the Russian ESL community, and yeah, we did a podcast talking about just that kind of thing, and you can very slightly perceive. It's harder for me because I'm not a native Russian, but you can very slightly. There's a very distinct kind of Ukrainian border accent.
Yeah.
That's easy to pick up. There's a slight Moscow accent, a very slight Petersburg accent, but again, not really.
Nothing like that kind of diversity of English. You know? And I mean, I've had like Swedish guys who've picked up English from watching Guy Ritchie movies and things, and like they turn up in London like, and they're sort of talking like this. You're like, what? How long you been living in London, Marcus? No, I just arrived, man. Okay.
You're very good at that. What do they call you faking? They call that, don't they?
Yeah.
Very good. You're quite the whiz with London accent. Where exactly in London do you live, by the way?
I live in Haringey in North London, sort of just north of Finsbury Park.
Okay, I'm with you. I'm not amazing on my London geography. I pop up there every now and again for a conference, but yeah, apart from that, don't know it too well. Anyway, Hugh, I'm conscious of your time because we've been going for an hour and a quarter already, so I'm going to let you get on. But there was lots more I wanted to ask you. So you know, if you'd ever be inclined to come on the show again,
I'd love to come back and do another one of these. It's been a very lovely, rambling, interesting, divergent conversation.
That's exactly how I like it. We went deep.
We did,
and we went fast. That's how we do it. Okay, Hugh, thanks very much for coming on, and I will see you when I see you, sir. Hopefully, once the lockdown's over and I'm in London next time.
Yeah, let me know, Mike. Yeah,
will certainly be quaffed merrily.
Let me know, and let me know when all of this goes live, and I'll share it myself as well. Yeah,
I'd be most grateful. Well, once we stop recording, we'll catch up. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Hugh. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye bye.